Secretary Pompeo repeatedly promised that he will hold the Iranian regime accountable for its human rights violations and for its treatment of the Iranian people. Today, we are continuing to deliver on this promise. The United States is listing IRGC Brigadier General Hassan Shavarpour under Section 7031C visa sanctions. General Shavarpour committed gross violations of human rights against protesters in Mashhad. He oversaw the massacre of 148 helpless Iranians in the Mashhad region last November. General Shavarpour was in command of units responsible for the violent crackdown and lethal repression around Mashhad. This is the first designation on an Iranian regime official being taken under the State Department authority from Section 7031C authorities. This action taken today was made possible through the information we received on the tip line that the Secretary established. The Iranian people have now sent us over 88,000 tips through the tip line that the Secretary established back in November. We use this information to expose the criminality of the regime and to hold violators accountable. Since the violent crackdown on protests last November, the United States has sanctioned 2 judges and 8 other regime officials for their roles in brutalizing the Iranian people. We are continuing to review all information we receive from the Iranian people, and we will continue to hold more regime officials responsible for human rights violations. Over the past week, many Iranians took to the streets again to protest a corrupt government that lies to them. President Trump recognized their courage with his tweets in Farsi this past week, standing with the Iranian people. We call on all nations to join our lead, particularly by sanctioning Iranian officials for human rights violations. The Iranian regime is in a deep economic crisis. Back in May of 2018, shortly after leaving the Iran nuclear deal, Secretary Pompeo said that we will deny revenue to Iran's clerics, who use it to fund terrorism and violence across the region. He said that Iran's expansionist foreign policy would no longer be cost-free and that the economic price would be severe. We have succeeded in raising the costs for Iran, and the regime is badly managing an economic crisis of its own making. The sanctions we have imposed are the toughest ever. They are making an enormous difference, and the Iranian people are rightly blaming their own government for 40 years of corruption, mismanagement, and kleptocracy. Iran's oil exports are down by more than 2 million barrels per day, reducing Iran's revenue from oil by more than 80%. This amounts to a loss of around $50 billion annually. Last month, President Rouhani admitted that Iran had lost $200 billion from U.S. sanctions since their reimposition. Iran is also facing a banking crisis, with roughly half of all bank loans in arrears. More than one in 4 young Iranians is jobless. Inflation is at 40%. Today, the question that people are asking is whether the regime has the competence to avoid a banking disaster and hyperinflation. The Iranian economy this year could contract by as much as 14%. The regime is also facing a budget crisis to fund its new 2020 budget, which comes out in March. Due to the staggering loss of oil revenue, it is nearly impossible for the regime to put forward a credible budget. After initially assuming oil exports would average 1.5 million barrels of oil per day in FY19, the regime later revised the figure down to 300,000 barrels. Today, Iran's supreme leader, in remarks, said that the country's reliance on oil should stop. It is therefore surprising that the draft budget released just this month for 2020 assumes oil exports will average around 1 million barrels per day. This number is pure fantasy, and the regime knows it. We should expect to see an enormous budget deficit this year.